mostly to what I did was like I do a summary of the chapter, then I do a summary of my summary, and yeah, I think, I mean, I have not in my mind what all the things happen, so I can read a bit what she talked in this chapter, and then we do some brainstorming. So let me share my screen.
Welcome, Ivy.
Okay, so this second half of the chapter was split into 3 big topics, which were the irrigation development project in Sri Lanka. I don't know what that's, but then the second was the fragility of Nova Scotian inshore fisheries, and then she do like a conclusion, but not only from this chapter, but also from other chapters of the book. So the first chapter, Irrigation Development Project in Sri Lanka, it was millions of dollars spent into development of irrigation in Sri Lanka, and the quality of paddy produced there had steadily grown in recent decades in 1950. Even if the quantity of rice produced had increased steadily, if it was shorter than expected. Well, I'm not doing it that good. Okay, basically what they did in Sri Lanka, they put a lot of money, and the quantity of paddy rice produced was growing, and well, then I'm not doing that right. Disappointed effects on the rice production is the discrepancy between the project plans and the project performance. To understand the discrepancy, we examine the relation between the quantity of water applied and the yield of paddy rice. Rice is highly sensitive to scarcity of water, and it helps the farmers work, which means that farmers have reasons to take a quantity of water even if it's illegal. On the other hand, water is scarce, and costly farmers are rarely required to pay full cost of, or even a cost. If farmers are able to follow their own unconstrained preference, they will apply more water that economically justified in order to reduce their own personal labor. That affects the plants, and the most effective project was run by the irrigation department with tight control. Project planning documents would require a high level of organization by the farmers themselves and strict discipline. Central government efforts to achieve such level of organization have not changed the fundamental incentives facing participants or their behavior. The dominant pattern of their behavior is to take as much water as their paddy fields will hold. And that was individualistic and needed to achieve collective action. In 1920 to 1958, Kirindioya system was managed by a subdivisional officer responsible to the director of irrigation engineering, was the only person with the power to instruct an irrigation overseer to release water from the tank, were then responsible for opening or closing the head gates. A different line of responsibility started at the level of the farmers. Belvidan were responsible for reporting on the progress made in cultivation and could enforce sanctions on cultivators. They were paid a share of the yield. That's why they were incentivized to make it work. A conflict between the revenue department, which wanted to save crops, and the irrigation department, which wanted a regular schedule and set a time to maintain the bond and channels. Agas regularly requested delays in the timing of water releases in order to prevent destruction of the first crop, which would lead to a lower tax shield on the land. The effects of such delays were failure of the second crop in many years and a cumulative deterioration in the maintenance of the system. Further, the conflict between the two agencies could be manipulated by larger landowners who play the concern of the agas for cultivation rather than irrigation maintenance. What? Oh, do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
I was just wondering if we could open a little bit for discussion. Thank you for presenting.
I actually like split it. Like for example, right now, if you see the line here, this line, that means like that's the first things I wanted to say, and then we discuss about the first part of the irrigation development, because that irrigation development had 3 stages, and that I just read is the first one. And yeah, I think we can discuss in this one, and then we move on the second one. And yeah, so I just finished that one. And what I understood is like at the beginning there was like engineering saying their plan, and they didn't take in consideration what the farmers were going to do, and that's why the first step was a bit of a failure. What do you guys think on this first part?
I thought it was really interesting to see the behavioral strategies that the individual farmers took in terms of cultivating the paddy rice. You know, the big strategy was that you're trying to reduce labor and get as much water as you possibly could in any way you possibly can. And so you have a bunch of farmers trying to get as much water for their yield as they possibly can, but they don't want to do the labor either. So they want to minimize the labor, and therefore they focus on these type of short-term incentivized gains rather than saying, let's build the infrastructure for longer-term sustainability. And that's when you had kind of the AGAs that came in. I can't remember what they're called again. The something like that. Vidanis. I can't remember the name of it. But yeah, they came in and tried to change the system up a little bit, but didn't work out too well either. So just my thoughts on it.
Anyone else, or should I continue like the second part?
I'll add something.
Awesome.
You know, as we're reading these books, I'm finding out things or learning new facts that are completely tangential to the material we're reading. But just one of the things that for some reason piqued my interest, and I think I will always remember, is the rice fields themselves. And, anytime you see rice fields, it's always sort of like this, like a little pool. It's very wet, and you think of like little pools of rice. And there's a line here that explains why the farmers of rice paddies overconsumed water, and it's essentially that the rice plants are extremely sensitive to a scarcity of water, but have no reaction to an overabundance of water. So also because of the kinds of crops that they happen to have been growing, and then I guess the second thing is that I think, as you mentioned, Nate, is that somehow it didn't exactly click for me how, but like the back-breaking work of picking the rice was alleviated somewhat by having the rice overflooded. So there was incentive to overflood these fields because it would be less effort, so less human labor, as well as without consequence to the yield. So there's a lot of incentive for farmers to continue to use as much water as they can, even if it harmed the other farmers around them. And then there's a line I like. I hope it's okay if I just read it out loud. The structures of incentives facing many farmers reinforces a short-term individualistic strategy and discourages efforts devoted to longer-term investments in the organizational structure needed to achieve collective action. And it's exactly, I think that sentence really encapsulates this whole first section, which is the individualistic, self-interested actions of each farmer defeat the ability to have a more sustainable collective good, frankly. Okay, that's it for now.
Yeah, I had a similar note on how the incentives were, like the fact that the incentives were so misaligned was the biggest failure. And it seemed to be the case in all of the examples she gave, that was the biggest thing of when incentives are not aligned, that's the root of conflict. And in all of those examples that are going wrong, conflict arises so quick. It's like it's one of the first things she describes about the CPR. It's how conflict escalates. And so yeah, it's an interesting note to keep in my mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so that was the first system they had, but then in 1958, they changed the system by the national government in an effort to make it more democratic. The revenue department was removed, replaced by the Department of Agrarian Services, which had no direct supervisory role in irrigation management. Then the Belvidens, that was a role the Belvidens were replaced by the administrative secretaries, and that arrangement generally enhanced the flexibility of the system, but reduced the level of coordination across the irrigation canals. The administrative secretary was responsible for enforcing compliance with the rules for water use, but he had fewer enforcement powers than had the Belvidans. The administrative secretary was paid from a fixed cash, whether or not the land was cultivated. He was dependent on satisfying farmers in his unit to some extent, or he could not be re-elected. No longer directly accountable to external agencies. Large landowners had some special privilege because of that, and effectively, the system had to operate without the service of coordination at the tract level. Disputes among irrigators were sometimes resolved in a violent manner. By the mid of 1970, control over water depth was non-existent. Although 200 reports of water poaching had been submitted, no one had been officially pursued. Several administrative secretaries indicate when interviewed that they did not file official actions against irrigators for water poaching, even though they regularly failed cases in the event of non-payment of the acreage taxes upon which they depend for their remuneration. And that was like, there was no law because, like, well, what do you guys think?
I think that whole section can just be summed up under the title bureaucracy. Sort of like it describes what a lot of us are familiar with in our countries of residency. The part where, where is it? Right. So, in the mid 1970s, basically water theft was just status quo. It was like jaywalking, right? Like technically it's against the law, but you'll never get arrested for it, And yeah. Wait, there was something else I wanted to point out about the Belvedens. So they were elected locally, but they reported to the assistant government agency employed by the revenue department, right? So it's like the agency of the department and the committee of the, so there's like all of these layers of bureaucracy. And it seems as if, sort of a few pages later, when these were, I guess, discontinued, then, some system was put in place that would actually have some communal input. So the people that were sort of controlling or monitoring the abuses of the water of the shared system had no responsibility to the community. They were not part of the community, and they didn't have any accountability to the community. And I think that's something that can often result in negligence, less care.
I also want to point out on page 166, where she points numbers 5 internal factors that she thinks influenced in the failure of the Quirindioya farmers. And what I want to say about this is that these internal factors are present in most of the CPR's institutions, because she recommends for the CPR institution to be like small, and we try to make it like with a large number of people, and that like is harder for the CPR institution to be endurable. And it also like connects some internal factors with external factors, because we saw in the last week that in Turkey, one factor that influenced on the failure of a institution was government, that there was no like political like political sustain for these changes. So for me, it's very different the reasons of why the CPR institutions failed in Turkey, and why in Sri Lanka, because in Turkey they failed because of the government, and the conflict is not the government itself, but it's the extreme motive of our to control the CPR. So yes, what I wanted to point out is that even there are some internal factors that are present in the different CPR institutions that makes them really complex, and all of them are very complex. The reason of why one fails and the other one fails is different. Comparing the case between Turkey and the case we are seeing here in Sri Lanka.
Awesome, thank you. Then the cultivation committees were abolished altogether in 1977, and their functions were given to appointed cultivation officers. A modest change was made in 1980 to create and elect a track leader, chosen and paid by the farmers. Track leaders are supposed to follow the orders of the cultivation officers. No one of the participants in the Kirindi Oya project is motivated to do anything but follow dominant strategies. For the large landowners, keeping active political contact with national leaders is one method of ensuring some protection for illegal practices. After a detailed analysis, Michael Moore concludes that it impedes efficient water management in several ways. Recruitment patterns, performance, few incentives for good work, and the bureaucracy is organized in a way that results in a devaluation of performance. Irrigators with the appropriate connections to party officials might never be prosecuted at all. Many settlements are heterogeneous, composed of individuals coming from different regions. The result has been to exacerbate siblings rivalries within families and encourage young men to seek opportunities elsewhere. These are difficult problems to overcome. The situation facing appropriators in such system is one of inexorable tragedy. Are the farmers doomed to eternal conflict and lack of cooperation unless there are major changes? Yes. Okay, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So one thing that always gets me that I keep thinking about in terms of, imagining how we apply kind of technology into CPR settings today and kind of give it a decentralized nature to it compared to what we've already built is that there's a distinct difference between analyzing institutional change in terms of implementing a method of governance over a CPR setting versus changing something that's already been built. So a lot of these situations, you don't have infrastructure at all. And so you slowly build that infrastructure. In this case, you have an infrastructure that is built with a bureaucracy that is not well managed and a system that was not well designed in the first place. And so having to change that in hindsight is a lot more difficult than it is to actually build it from scratch in the first place. And so I think that's a really kind of an important aspect to think about when it comes to the vision here at Common Stack is and stuff like that, is that we're dealing with entrenched institutions of managing of these structures, and to overcome that it takes a different approach. So yeah.
I thought an interesting point to that too was that he talks about how engineers strongly identified with building and the first stages of putting something up, but they didn't have so much esteem, like they weren't recognized, or it wasn't the prestigious part of their profession to maintain the structures that they created and to operate them. So I feel like there's also, it's easy to get into this mentality that it's so hard to change something because there is no even personnel that have some type of knowledge into like maintenance and modification of a system that already exists, that people were all about like just building a new one and not being there anymore.
Yeah, I really like that point. Sorry, my comment is going to be quick. I think there's something to go back to what Juan Carlos was saying about these the 5 points or the 5 internal factors, and one of them being that most of the farmers were poor settlers who've been basically relocated and had no attachment to the land, and then even the engineers thought that the farmers were not capable of, managing for themselves, right? So there's just mistrust built into it. There's just these weren't members of a community who had ties into the CPR. They were laborers, and I think that takes something away. Not take something away, but there's something like the lack of feeling that there's an ownership of something. Contributes to sort of I don't know, reckless is the wrong word, but it's the word that it contributes to the like lackadaisical reaction to caring for that something, if it's not something that you own and that you value. I just wanted to add that too. Juan Carlos, to you.
Okay, so the next there was a dramatic turnaround. Story has occurred on the left bank of the Gale Oya irrigation project. The system has three major divisions: the river division, the right bank, and the left bank. Channels had not been maintained, and their banks were broken and silted. The original project design called for regimentation of the farmers and increased law enforcement. Final proposal, which called for the organizations of farmers throughout COLP to ensure that farmers would contribute free labor to rehabilitate and then maintain the channels that serve their fields in order to increase efficient use of water. The final project assigned certain funds and responsibility to Agrarian Research and Training Institute for Farmers Organizations. RT was assisted by Rural Development Committee at Cornell University. The RT Cornell team, on consideration, rejected the goal stated in the project plan to devise the test a single model of farmer organization. Instead, the RT Cornell team chose to introduce catalysts into a situation of mutual distrust and unpredictability. Then the IOs were created could be college graduates, because in Sri Lanka there was a lot of highest educational level among less developed countries, and applicants were recruited with farm backgrounds. The IOs received about 6 weeks of training, and IOs was expected first to meet each farmer sharing water. After becoming familiar with a small group of farmers sharing the same field channel to plan self-help strategies, instead of establishing a predefined organization, the EO tried to form working committee to solve particular problems. Once farmers were used to working together and had achieved benefits from group action, the IO would then help from a local organization and select through consensus a farmer representative. And this one could report back to the other farmers. The RT Cornell provided discussion between the farmers and engineers. Farmers were expected to contribute labor to rehabilitation and maintenance to convince the engineers that the high levels of labor contribution were far more likely if the farmers were consulted during the design stages of the rehabilitation. By the time the design phase was initiated, the farmers had already begun to work together. The field channel organization was the basic organizational building block for the Gal Oya. Distributory channel organization, each DCO developed its own organization arrangements. All farmers and committees made up of the farmer representative from the FCO. There are 4 major areas in COLP, and each was represented by an area of council. The 4th tier of organization was initiated by the farmer representative and the IOs. The project committee provides a forum in which farmers can directly participate. Farmer behavior has changed markedly since the evolution of new institutions for collective action. The result of that effort was an additional 1,000 acres broad under civilization, benefiting 300 families. Farmers have regularly participated in group projects organized by their own FCOs. Conflict among farmers has also declined. It was unusual to find farmers from all parties holding offices in FCOs and TCOs and working well together. The attitudes of farmers toward the officials of the irrigation department changed, as did the attitudes of the officials towards the farmers. Better understanding and mutual trust was created. The major weakness of the Cal Olla organization program was that the farmers were expected to undertake construction at the field channel level without pay, unrealistic hope. The project has left organizations in place that can continue to develop new skills and new problem-solving abilities. It seems unlikely that the farmers or the officials by themselves would have overcome the structure of the situations they face without external intervention. However, was not that a central agency regimenting the farmers by enforcing rules. Farmer representatives were selected through a consensus. Farmers were organized on 4 mutually reinforcing levels and were given recognition and encouragement. Most important, farmers saw that their own proposals were treated seriously for the first time by irrigators, officials, and they saw definitive results. Okay, what are your thoughts? I think that's very likely related to what gravity is doing.
Yes, I think it's very related to what we all are doing in our efforts, and especially soft gov, gravity, transparency, legal. Those are very, very, very related to all this that we are reading in these chapters.
Yeah, go ahead, Libby.
I actually cried when I when I read this chapter. I think I was so sensitive today, but it was so beautiful when there was the solution of like simply people coming with the willingness to help, and they were divided in these groups, and it gave all the fractal structure that that made people that basically brought peace, because people wanted so much to solve the situation. And it brings back to something she mentioned in another chapter, that it's not because people want to be in this like forever competition and sucking all the resources and like behaving in a way that is bad for everyone. It's just because they don't know how to organize each other. And then something like simple as that, just students that were willing to collaborate with the situation and willing to move to the place. And I think that was important because they were getting closer to the issue. They were like putting themselves in there and understanding what were becoming familiar with the farmers and their problems, and just then proposing very local solutions to these groups of 12 to 15 farmers. And then this created a crazy, like the percentages flipped completely from like 6% of them were happy, then 80% of them were happy with what was being built. So it was like very inspiring.
I've been a horrible community member. I have not been a part of the Dow Book Club. I apologize. I do have to say, this is really interesting to me because have the people here, are you familiar with Utopia by St. Thomas More? Anyone? No? Okay. So it's really interesting. So that book is a catalyst to various economies. It's not widely talked about, but it is a very, very classical book. The point of Utopia, well, there's many, but one is the fact that it's told from a third-person perspective of someone going somewhere to an island where the community itself actually engages in what you're actually talking about. It's really wild. And I would also like to, for this moment, just because, how to say this? So government comes from farming. So the first farmers were the actual initial creation of government, because at one time, you know, if you can teach a man to fish, he'll fish for his life. If you give him a fish, he'll eat for a day. We all know that. That's kind of where government came in, because they started creating fish for themselves to give to the people. So people lost their ability to fish. So it's not really actually a tribe. It becomes something centralized. And our roughest understanding of that is that system, that point of control. So anyways, there's a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel and the Fates of Human Societies. And it's wrote by Jared Diamond. And he's a Pulitzer Prize winner for that book. And it's fantastic. And it's an explanatory power of how we are where we are. And he is a professor of biology at, geology, excuse me. He's a professor of geology at Berkeley. Anyways, so those two books on top of this book, which is just, God, I should read this. I'm such a horrible community member. It's really, really interesting. And before I'm sorry, I'm just kind of ranting, and I'm just jumping into your call, and I really apologize. I kind of want to talk about the Algonquin, because I think I had something rolling a while back about the Algonquin Nation, because it's huge. That was another book, Gods of War, Gods of Peace, and how early religion shaped Native America. Because what's really interesting about this, and I'll pose this to the community itself, is what happened to the Mohawk. So the Mohawk was this incredible warrior nation, and they were the defense of the Algonquin, and their ties to the nation were incredible. Then, like, you have to try and imagine that nothing could be stronger. But yet they were broken. And they weren't broken because of Christianity. They weren't broken because they were defeated by a stronger military power. They weren't. The British didn't know what the fuck to do with the Mohawk. They were a stronger force than they were, because they fought an entirely different way of battle. But yet they were broken. So why were they defeated? Because the Mohawk, they accepted commerce. They went from, they were hunters and gatherers, and that was a big part of their way of life. And because the British could monetize their goods, they found out that badger pelts or beaver pelts, the fur, the hide, was actually valuable. And there was a market for it in Europe. They no longer ceased to care about what they did for their overall community. The individuals of the Mohawk found out that they could get rich. And they did. And they basically sold out their own community. And the Mohawk, when the warrior nation gave in, a big part of the Algonquin suffered. And now various tribes that could not defend themselves, or more importantly, what really sucked was the goods that came to them were no longer there, because they were now going to the British. So, self-interest really, really destroyed the Mohawk. And in turn, unfortunately, that catalyst was huge in destroying the Algonquin as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see like how community and especially government and the context of like CPR settings in general. Like if you look at the Sri Lanka, if you look at their history, I'm looking at the wiki right now of like the kind of turmoil that they were going through, and to have people who like came together like they did here to actually create a system to manage these, this irrigation of these places, and in the context of basically a coup d'etat and a civil war at the time, and create value for their community is pretty impressive, especially when you have such diverse cultural aspects of it. And I think like part of like what Ostrom forgets about is to take in consideration the state and their role in everything, and how they approach these types of settings. Like, what do they benefit out of it? Are they getting stuff off of this land as well? And I think that's important to consider as well. So, yeah, just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, that's some feedback, guys, and contributions. What related to the Jake book, I think that's a really good book. I really want to read after Ostrom, but by myself. I think it's a very good book. The first time you mentioned that, I was so excited. And then the fragility of Nova Scotian inshore fishes. That's like another case. It's not related to the past one. And that's some fragile institutions devised by CPR's appropriators are still in use and effective. The eastern coast of Canada is dotted with small fishing villages. The fishers have developed their own rules. The local rule system controls who can enter the fishery and how local fishing grounds are divided among fishers. They all fish from relatively small boats. Most of the fishing villages along the southwestern coast of Nova Scotia have broadly defined fishing territories. The offshore boats also go considerably farther to sea. Herring and mercurgill nets are set in rectangular areas beyond the harbor but close to shore. If they were set farther inshore, they would restrict travel in and out of the harbor, and if set farther to sea, they could be destroyed by the strong currents. Similar areas are set aside from lobstering. Basically, the Port Lameron fishers have divided their territory on pragmatic grounds, reflect practical and informal resource management strategies developed by a community of fishermen through years of experience. Not all technologies are mutually compatible. 4 of the captains purchased offshore Cronfield nets in 1975. Disposed of that year by 1980. The division of the territory into zones reduced the externalities that the use of one technology might impose on others, but also constitute a low cost for apporting a reasonable yield of all participants. The cost of monitoring an apportioning scheme based on an easily observable factor what technology a boat is using is much lower. They see themselves as having exclusive rights to their lobster territory. In addition, they exercise the right of first access, on the right to refuse access in years of scarcity to the remaining zone. The years of scarcity are when conflict can erupt. Policing their boundaries is something that all fishers do. This rule system is fragile because it is not recognized by federal authorities in Canada. The federal stance toward local rules has been exactly the opposite. Federal officials presume that the entire eastern coast is open access fishery. 2 options are available: private property rights and government regulation. Ruling out private property leads to an official policy of federal government regulation. Many of the government's initial steps have been related to efforts to licensed fishing vessels, given that many full-time and part-time fishers fear that the licensing is only beginning of an effort to reduce the number of fishers in the industry who were not currently active in fishing obtain commercial fishing license. When federal officials then froze the number of licenses available without prior notice, threatened sanctions against those funds using gill nets illegally. Conflict exploded in the community. Canadian policy has been to develop one standard set of regulations for the entire coast. If future Canadian policies produce still further counterproductive reactions of the part of the fishers, they may fail to gain control of the open access deep sea fishery and lose control of some inshore fisheries previously subject to entry control. Develop a set of nested rules that would help enforce the local regulations that have been developed over the years, while focusing most of new regulatory effort on the far offshore fisheries that are indeed open access, then this fragile rule system could survive. However, in Canadian authorities continue to try to develop a single policy for all fishers along the entire eastern coast. The eventual deterioration of the locally evolved system seems probable. Federal officials in Canada are not the only officials who have presumed an absence of local institutions for regulating CPRs and have taken actions that have either threatened or destroyed existing institutions. Then in Brazilian territorial, there was a communal control over local forests. In 1978, the government of Nepal reversed its policy and began to encourage the transfer of forest land back to village control, with quite encouraging results in regard to forestation efforts. Any thoughts on that? That was basically a fragile common, since there was they were local fishers with small boats, and then the government intervened, and that's what broke a bit the system. But at the beginning, it was working good when the small boats were just fishing and taking care of the common. But yeah, then it got interrupted by federal and got some problems.
I like in this chapter how she refers back to chapter 1, specifically around how we know that there's public property and private property, but it's hard to think of an alternative to those two, and it's very easy to think of those two as the most effective because of the scarcity of CPRs or successful CPRs. And this Nova Scotia example is really interesting because there's generations and generations and generations who have built this probably difficult to achieve and maintain and manage governance system, self-governance system. And the government, probably well-intentioned, tries to have some sort of uniform rule around fishing in the coast of the whole country, and almost, I would imagine, almost accidentally treads on this like successful CPR. I don't know that was their intention. Their intention was probably just to have uniform rules along the coast, but it's like a big clumsy giant who just steps on this little CPR who has been functioning so nicely for many generations. It's when governments try to create order and rules, their intention is probably very positive, but in this case, the result was that it affected the people who had, you can only imagine through lots of negotiations and lots of like small town meetings, and have structured this very careful governance system and then didn't have the right to hold on to it. And it goes to Ostrom's 8th principle, that commons works best when they're nested within larger networks. In this case, the larger network refused to accept this smaller commons nested inside it. And the larger networks, of course, like the national government.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. Then at the end of the chapter, what Eleanor do is lessons to be learned from comparing the cases in the study. And what I highlighted is like those institutions have already shown themselves capable of surviving for 30 or 40 years, so they are robust. And then what I really like was this table. And there we can see like all the cases we study, if they have clear boundaries, membership, congruent rules, collective choice arenas, monitoring, periodic sanctions, conflict resolution mechanism, recognized rights to organize nested units, and then it was like the result. And I think that's amazing because it's more like it's what we are waiting, and we are trying to have yes, and on all the inputs. And I think it should be a robust institutional performance. But on this end of the chapter, I would like to hear from all of you. What are your conclusions on this?
I always love the chart that evaluates systems, so that made it very easy to read. And it just depends on context of a lot of things. I think it's very valuable to have and to think in this way, and she does a great job of highlighting those areas that need to be evaluated. But I think there are more to it than that. Anytime you have a system that is nested within another system, there are multiple variables that you have to also consider. But this is a good foundation for analyzing CPR settings, and I love it.
I also love that she says that these are not like the only rules, that there should be more work around this to see if we need like additional principles that maybe she missed. But I really liked, and I really like this chart, because like it explains the whole book. Like we've been reading a lot of cases, and each case is different from the other, and each case has some success rate and some failure rate, and some of the failures of some of the cases are different from the other cases. But I think that one of the strengths of these 8 principles to measure institutional performance is that they are somewhat neutral. They are not like a criteria that changes from case to case, but is a criteria that stays the same even if you choose different cases to compare. So I really like this chart. And another thing that I remember is that she said that the failing institutions only had at maximum 3 principles. So like after 3 principles, you can say like we pass from failure to fragile. And when there are more, like almost all of the principles that have yes, we can then have this robust. So I think that yes, it would be like really nice if in TC you can have like this chart and say and have like a checklist of yes, and recognize which are like the points that we should keep improving. here it says NR is not relevant in the first two cases. So we should also identify which are our weak points right now, and which points are also not so much relevant for our purpose.
I noticed something in there that I was expecting to see but didn't, and maybe she was thinking about it, but I think scale is a great variable to have in there, because those yes and no marks are really dependent on how big or how small the CPRs are. So if we compare an organization that has all of the checks marked, but it's only a smaller an organization, or let's say 100 or not even 1,000 persons in there, it can be another valuable thing to analyze. So I was expecting maybe or update this table and see how many people were in there in that participating as a CPR, because we know as things go up and the scale, everything tends to break.
I really like that, even having this very formal chart, that it's very like a metric. Reading the examples, it gives so much the human depth to it, and understanding what are those metrics made of. And they are so, yeah, they are so human. It's so much talking about trust, about reputation, about feeling each other in the community, about collaboration. So it's really cool to think that most of the metrics that exist in organizations, institutions, corporations, or whatever it is, they're always rooted in humans and in human relations. And we are on the top of the hour, and thank you so much, Zep, for guiding us here. That was great. This was
Thank you to you guys. I was a bit nervous, and yeah, just being here with you, it was quite easy. So thank you so much, and yeah, thank you.
Did a great job, Zep.
Hey, Zep, are you there?
Yes.
You need to read this. You need to read this one too. This is called The Ascent of Money by Neil Ferguson.
Oh, but that's not the other one you were talking. The war.
No, this is a different book. You need to read this one too.
Okay, but one by one. But thank you so much, Jake.
Dude, I can give you like 30 books a week, dude.
You're amazing, man.
And let's raffle the pen. I'll give you guys numbers, and we'll do this very quick. And while we do the raffling, you guys can think who wants to guide us in the next session. So Juan, number 1, Tam, number 2, Jake 3, Livia 4, Zep 5, Griff 6, Nate 7, Mateo 8, Ivy 9. And we have number 4. Who's number 4? Oh, I was number 4. Yes.
Woo! Congrats.
Yeah, that worked out.
Huh?
Jake's calling scam. No, just kidding. Yay, finally.
Scam. I'm calling scam. I am. Scam.
Okay, let me share my screen with you, Jake. Here, you see number 4, 1 to 9.
Look at it.
Not cheating. Okay, so who wants to facilitate the next session?
I'll take the next one if nobody else does.
Yes. Amazing. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're almost
Thank you.
done.
Just one question. Are we reading all of chapter 6 and our stopping point?
Oh, no, we're having a stopping point. Thanks, Tim. Is it okay to post in the...
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I feel like Tam has his book mapped out already.
She does. Do you have a suggestion?
I've been looking, and I actually find it difficult to figure out if we there's these two evaluating evaluating benefits, evaluating costs on 198, and I feel maybe up to evaluating costs on 198, so 182 to 198, and then 198 to 216 might be a good way to break it apart.
Until 198. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Okay, guys. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Hey, Ivy, thank you.